Hello, everyone. I'm Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. While the city's newspaper war continues, the biggest battle is going on behind the scene at the legislature. There, the qualifications for publishing government legal notices are being reconsidered. Elsewhere in the Capitol, an unlikely coalition is trying to find relief for the state's nation-leading incarceration rate. We'll be looking at these stories tonight, as well as soaring numbers at the airport, a council member investigated, when past governors gather, and our Future Watch segment examines the port's international business. On board for us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol, Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Tyler Bridges, reporter, The Lens. Don Ostrom, Channel 12's Future Watch reporter. And Stephanie Grace, columnist, The New Orleans Advocate. First, we're going to go on over to Tyler and talk about the behind-the-scenes newspaper war up there at the legislature, and this really involves a lot of dollars.
Can we do this in front of Stephanie?
Yes, yeah, we can.
I want to hear
it. So tell us what's going on there. What the New Orleans Advocate is trying to become one that can perhaps publish legal notices. They can't right now.
Right. It's a very sort of inside thing where these legal notices that the various governmental entities are by law publish, and the Advocate wants in on it. And John Georges, the owner of the Advocate, has spoken to several legislators who are sponsoring legislation that would allow the New Orleans Advocate to compete, not to actually get the notices, but to compete. They're generally done on a lowest bid basis, and naturally, the person or the entity that has most of these contracts right now is the Times-Picayune, and so they have hired lobbyists to oppose this legislation before the state legislature in Baton Rouge.
How much money is in publishing the legal notices?
The one contract that I saw was that in Jefferson Parish, the sheriff legal notices. These are for like auctions of property, maybe about $100,000, maybe a little bit more. But there's a bunch of these different contracts that basically classified ads that different governmental entities in Jefferson and Orleans parishes let out. And again, John Georges, the new owner of the Advocate, again, I make the distinction of the New Orleans Advocate, they want to have an opportunity to compete.
And why can't they right now?
Because the state law does not allow them to. The state law right now says you have to have been in business for 5 years, and the New Orleans Advocate has been there for, what is it?
About a year and a half.
About a year and a half.
Or a year, depending on what you consider the start time.
Well, for the longest time, the law said you had to be a daily newspaper,
right,
which pretty much narrowed it down to the Times-Picayune. And then when the Times-Picayune went 3 times weekly, then that was changed, but it says you have to be there for 5 years. And so now they're asking to change that time restriction to a much shorter period, which would allow up the competition. And the other key point, I think, to this, Tyler, is that this really applies to Jefferson Parish within the greater New Orleans area, because the state law governs that. It doesn't govern the city of New Orleans, because that's covered by the New Orleans City Charter. So that'd be a separate battle altogether. Is that correct?
Yeah, and so these are the deciders are the sheriff of New Orleans or Orleans Parish, Newell Norman, the sheriff of Jefferson Parish, but also the town of Kenner. They do these legal notices. So does Harahan, levy boards, all sorts of entities out there. So if you add it all up, it actually could add up to a chunk of nice change for an industry that is struggling to get whatever dollars it can get. So there should be some sort of battle in the legislature. Again, what the New Orleans Advocate wants to do is just have the right to compete, and then they would have to offer the lowest bid. And we should also mention that New Orleans City Business has also had contracts in Jefferson Parish to run these legal notices.
And has Gambit
and
also?
Gambit too, right?
Gambit is also, they were allowed in 2009. They were what the Advocate is seeking today. Gambit sought in 2009 for Jefferson Parish, and they've gotten some contracts. And then Errol, as you mentioned, with the Picayune making the decision to publish 3 days a week in 2012, the legislature had to change the law. And I think the Advocate has also benefited from that as well.
Historically, publishing the legals has been a main source of income, especially for smaller newspapers. In rural areas, just about every county, or in Louisiana's case, parish has a newspaper, and that newspaper exists primarily because their main advertiser is the government through those legals, and so it's always been a big source of income, and it may be one that with future debate that people may say we don't need anymore, that we don't need to have the printed legals.
Yeah, about a year and a half ago, I wrote a story for The Lens about a major issue, how the governor's office, how Bobby Jindal was able to get through a law through the legislature that makes his records much more difficult for the public to, or reporters to find out what he's up to. And the Press Association did not want to go to bat on that issue because what the issue that these really smaller newspapers that are members of the Press Association, Louisiana Press Association, care about is that issue that the governments continue to advertise in their local newspapers. But there's probably a day coming, and we're already seeing some pressure on that, to put everything on the internet. And so if the owner, the advocate, is able to get the legislation through, there probably is a day in the fairly near future where everything will just go, all these legal notices will go online.
And so these proposals are just beginning to move through the legislature, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, thanks a lot, Tyler. Let's talk about a gathering of governors
Yes.
past that happened, this past week?
Wednesday night at Loyola University.
Institute of Politics. So how do the governors...
It was a lot of fun.
How do the governors get along, the past governors?
They seem to get along great. I should tell you which governors
Yes.
were there. Buddy Roemer, Kathleen Blanco, and Edwin Edwards, of course, who's everywhere these days. There's a little irony. Mike Foster, who was famously travel-averse when he was in office, was traveling, so he couldn't make it. But, it really reminded me, we were talking about this a little earlier, of, you hear about the President's Club, the people, Bill Clinton and George Bush who get along so well, and really the idea is no one else, very few people have been where they've been. I think it's really the case with these governors. They really, there was one Republican, two Democrats, very different outlooks historically, but they really had they had a lot in common in the way they looked at government, what was happening now. And the other thing that was interesting is, two of them are now out of politics. One of them is Edwin Edwards, so he generally speaks his mind anyway. But they, freed from the political pressure, they were very blunt about certain issues that a lot of other politicians really dance around these days. For example, all three came out and endorsed the levee board lawsuit, that very controversial levee board lawsuit that very few politicians have embraced. This is against the oil and gas industry, of course.
Whereas the governor is...
The governor is very much against it. Even Kathleen Blanco, interestingly, who used to call herself an oil and gas governor when she was in office, said, and she said in the past that she takes a lot of pride in creating these independent levee boards that are now also kind of under attack because they filed the lawsuit, the Southeast, the one in this area in particular. But she said, look, the oil and gas industry, they know this is overdue. They know, and she thinks the lawsuit is good because it will bring the different parties to the table and there will be a negotiated settlement. And that was really interesting.
What did the other governors have to say about what Kathleen Blanco had to endure as being governor during Katrina?
They were very supportive, which again is not really surprising. I'm sure they're imagining that what if this had happened on their watch. Buddy Roemer said she absolutely, did the best she could under the circumstances. Edwin Edwards agreed. And, really focused on the positive, focused on, getting the billions of dollars out of Congress under very difficult circumstances, partisanship, and, more power from the Mississippi delegation than the Louisiana delegation, things like that.
And curious from reading your column that Blanco was fairly kind to George W. Bush, who at the time she was very critical of, but said it wasn't his fault, it was the people who he hired to advise him. But she blames him for hiring those people.
She does, yes. She said she had a good relationship with him. That's kind of where the question started, how's your relationship with him? She said she thinks he was badly handled, is the phrase she used. And, we know she didn't mention the name Karl Rove, but certainly the name has come up many times in this context, that the feeling is the administration tried to put the blame on the Democratic governor for its own shortcomings.
And in your column with The Advocate, didn't you also write that the three governors are supportive of Common Core, which is a big issue in Baton Rouge right now?
Hugely controversial, but not in this group. All very much for. And now, of course, Buddy Roemer's son, who's the president of Bessie, is one of the leading proponents of it. So.
Right. And very involved with charter schools.
Yes.
Okay, so just real quickly, Stephanie,
Yeah.
the assessment of these governors of where we stand now as a state.
Blanco and Roemer a little more pessimistic, Edwards a little less. He said, this is one of his Bobby Jindal jokes. He said, I travel all over the country, not as much as the governor does, but it's really not so much worse here. It's Yeah.
It must have been an interesting thing to sit
really
through, to
was,
listen to the
yeah.
three of them. Thanks a lot, Stephanie. Dawn, okay, over to you now. In Future Watch, we're talking about our port and international business for the port. How's it looking these days?
It is looking very bright, actually. We talk a lot about the port when we're talking about cruise ships, and we've talked recently about the Riverwalk redevelopment around the port. But business around the port isn't just tourists and shopping. It's a lot of international business, and the port within the last month has signed a new representative agreement with a port in India. They will have a representative office opened there, an office in India, the Samsara Shipping Group. And the goal is to increase business between here and India. We import a lot of steel from India, and it's used through the oil and gas industry. Also looking at other imports from there, textiles and furnishings, and just a way to increase business. The port has also now signed a memorandum of understanding with a port in Lithuania. It struck me as interesting that our port is doing business with all these countries all over the place. With Lithuania, what they've agreed to do is really, when they have these memorandums of understanding, it's an exchange of information, how we operate, how we bring things in, how we connect to the rails, how they do it, figuring out best practices and sharing some of that information back and forth. And it doesn't just happen with India and Lithuania. They have representative offices also in Tokyo, in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and a remote office in New Jersey, because that is where a lot of these a lot of the shipping industry is headquartered in our nation. So there's an office in industry. But as far as India goes, they say, we have excellent connectivity here with rail and barge and track throughout the United States and Canada, so it's a real opportunity to grow two-way business between their port and our port.
So most often, what's coming in the port and what's going out?
Well, we've got a lot of chicken going out of the port. Chicken is one of the biggest things that's going to Lithuania. The frozen chicken.
We're a leading chicken port.
We are a leading chicken port. Last year, we shipped 36,701 short tons of frozen poultry to Lithuania. We're hoping to.
Why haven't we seen Governor Jindal doing a photo op with the chicken?
Right, and a lot of that involves the New Orleans cold storage business, which just opened a brand new facility right along the river in the port. So all of these different relationships really tie in different business, not just the port, but increases business to other New Orleans businesses or regional businesses, and increases the rail traffic and the truck traffic. The Port of New Orleans signed memorandums of understanding last year with the Port of Guadeloupe, with the Port of Ulsan in South Korea, and with Qasr in Iraq, where we end up shipping different chemicals from the oil industry. So there's a lot of business. The agreements date way back. There's been a long-standing agreement with the Port of Kashira in Japan. But with Lithuania, the big business will be chicken. With India, the big business should be steel. I asked, how much government involvement is there? It almost sounds like the port is doing foreign relations here. They're not. It's all business and above board, but the United States there's commercial involvement from a federal level.
So this is all really just marketing strategy, essentially, all of these representative offices and memorandum of understanding, et cetera.
It's creating partnerships for trade opportunities.
So if we go to Lithuania and get their equivalent of chicken soup, that chances are the chicken came to New Orleans.
Right. Well, it could have, but it's not necessarily.
And soon they'll be opening a Popeyes there.
Right. It's not necessarily back and forth. We might be sending them chicken. We might not be importing anything back from Lithuania, but sending the chicken out, importing the steel from India, all it does is increase the traffic in the business.
All right. Well, going from shipping interest to the air, do we have any nonstops to Lithuania yet, Errol?
No, and we should. Obviously. Okay. Our airport, I think, is misunderstood. That when people from New Orleans, when they travel elsewhere and they go to these big airports where you got these concourses and you need to take these trams from one concourse to the other, and they see all these rows of kind of like she shops, Cartier, and they say, well, why isn't New Orleans airport like that? Well, those are all hub airports, and I'm not sure if we want that, because to get that kind of airport, first of all, you need a lot of land, so you probably have to drain Lake Pontchartrain or the swamps, and I think there'd be some sort of resentment to that.
That certainly would
So what we have is what's called an origin and destination airport, that people who get off the planes here are pretty much coming to the New Orleans area. They're not waiting to connect to another flight. And people who are leaving here are pretty much, leaving because they were in the New Orleans area. As we know, in the airport, especially now, if people haven't been to the airport recently and see the improvements, I mean, they're really nice. I've always thought it was a passenger-friendly airport. There's no really long concourses, even when you're in the plane. I mean, you're not like number 40 waiting to take off.
Right, so can I ask you a question?
Yes.
So why is it that Mayor Landrieu is so hot on getting a big new terminal and changing all of that if the airport is in such good condition right now?
Well, I didn't say it couldn't be better, and I think that's the thing too. I think they'd always like to get more airlines that are operating. Look, airport. Anytime you go to an airport, anywhere you see construction going on, the airports always have to keep up. They always have to be doing something. But last year they were really proud that that there was growth in what they call employments and deployments, the number of people going in and out, with like 9 million people last year.
And each person pays a fee on their ticket.
Yeah. And I think I was on that flight too with the 9 million. And so our airport showed growth where some of the bigger airports really showed a decline last year. The biggest carrier is Southwest. Southwest is 33% of the business. And actually, Southwest is sort of what they call a mini hub, because like if people are coming from Texas, they may change planes in New Orleans. And there's, the joke has always been if you're going anywhere from New Orleans, you got to go through Atlanta. But actually, there's 42 nonstop destinations. And just in the last couple of weeks, Southwest added Reagan International in Washington. In the past, if you other than United, if you wanted to go to Washington, you had to go through Baltimore, and they also brought back San Diego, and then Errol, Alaska is coming and creating a nonstop to Seattle. So there's more and more nonstops. The one thing that I still think we're sort of weak on is on international destinations. There's one flight a day to Toronto, and I think it's one of those smaller type jets operated by Air Canada. Seasonally, there's a flight a day to Montego Bay and another flight a day to Cancun. So there's really 3 international destinations. And the airport, there was a time it was a lot better than that, because it used to be the airport was the hub to Latin America, back when you had airlines like TACA and LAXA and Sasha. None of those airlines exist anymore. And so so all that traffic was pretty much lost through Houston. But other than that, other than the international destinations, the airport's being fairly successful.
So we've seen the business increase. Post-Katrina, we've just steadily seen our airport improve.
Absolutely. And of course, as the convention business grows, that helps, and as the vacation business grows, that helps, and both of them are growing.
All right, Errol, thanks a lot. I'm going to go back over to Tyler right now, and you wrote an article about really an unlikely coalition of groups that have come together to work on reducing the incarceration rate in Louisiana, which supposedly is the worst, the highest in the world per capita. So
well,
tell us more about what's happening here.
Yeah, we can clearly state it's the highest in this country. Mm-hmm. And as I wrote in a story for The Lens, that we can invite comparisons to North Korea. And traditionally, trying to reduce the incarceration rate has been an issue of more groups on the left. But now, and this is this strange bedfellows, you have groups on the right that are joining with groups on the left, and you've got some businessmen involved in this effort as well. And there's some interesting legislation in Baton Rouge right now, various things that would try to bring down that incarceration rate.
So the interest of each of these different groups on the different sides, is one more of a business interest in terms of saving taxpayer dollars and the other more of a social interest, would you say? Or are they both sort of blended? No,
Marcia, I think it's not exactly divides the way you described it, but generally it does divide that way. And again, the more interesting thing, I think, is the conservatives who are now supporting it. For example, there is a bill in Baton Rouge that this unlikely coalition supports, a Senate bill by J.P. Morrell of New Orleans, a Democrat, and the other sponsor of this bill is Senator Robert Adley, a conservative Republican from Northwest Louisiana, and this bill would decriminalize marijuana possession on the second and third possession.
Make it misdemeanor.
Yeah, turning it into a misdemeanor. And what's really happening is your former paper, the Times-Picayune, where I also work too, but it really, one of the things that kicked off this in Louisiana was a terrific series by a woman named Cindy Chang, who was one of those reporters who's left the Picayune. 8-part series in 2012 that really highlighted how Louisiana's very high incarceration rate and looked at some of the problems behind it and the reasons for it. A second factor,
What is the biggest reason for it? Are our laws just that much stiffer? Are our people that much worse? Do we have a bigger problem with recidivism? Is it?
It's a series of factors, but it's not simply the crime rate. One of the factors that Cindy Chang wrote about is that Louisiana is the highest rate of state inmates in local jails. Why? Because she wrote that the local sheriffs, the money that they get for their inmates is enough money that they can not only take care of the inmate, but then they have some extra money for their sheriff's cars or others, or pay salaries. So it's an incentive for them to keep as many inmates in these local jails as possible. One of the problems with the local jails is that these inmates don't get any retraining, any schooling, because someday they're going to get out. Right. And one of the reasons it's believed that Louisiana has such a high recidivism rate is because these guys who go out, they just get, here's a bus ticket. You go home.
And then it's hard for them to find jobs.
Right.
It's very, very difficult for people to find employment.
The irony that series highlighted was the people who are in the Angola, places like that, who likely will never get out. They get very good job training, but the people who are likely to get out are more likely in these local jails.
And so again, even with the job training, they're finding it very difficult to actually get employed, and so I believe that's something also that's being looked at by the legislature. But I want to ask you, Tyler, we see this coalition of support. Is there only support for this movement, or is there some opposition?
Well, clearly there's opposition because there's the traditional view in Louisiana, which is lock them up, throw away the key. They're bad people. We don't want them in the street. We have no sympathy for them. Don't let them have TVs. Don't let them have air conditioning in prison. But interestingly enough, one of the factors behind the creation of this unlikely coalition is that Texas, not exactly, warm and fuzzy state, they have passed various measures there that have brought down the incarceration rate and provided, for example, more money for retraining and schooling for inmates before they get out. And so that people are looking at Texas going, well, if Texas is doing it, and it's not only in Texas, it's actually some prominent conservatives nationally have an organization they call Right on Crime. And again, that's providing both an argument for doing something, but also provides political cover. So now conservatives can say, hey, well, wait a second, they're doing it in Texas. Newt Gingrich or Jeb Bush or Grover Norquist and national conservatives are also supportive of this idea of finding more ways to bring down the incarceration rate in Louisiana. It must be a good thing to do.
So this is just starting once again also to really move through the legislature, so I'm sure that you'll be keeping up on that and letting us know what's going on.
Yes.
Okay, thanks a lot, Tyler. Back to Stephanie. One of our council persons really, was it the Louisiana Attorney Disciplinary Board?
Yes.
Is not too happy with him right now.
Correct. And again, this is James Gray, recently reelected to represent District E in New Orleans. Not accused of doing anything on his job as a councilman. These allegations have to do with his role as a private attorney. And basically, this Louisiana Attorney Disciplinary Board has recommended that he either be disbarred or lose his license for at least 3 years. So it's pretty serious. And the allegations have to do with basically how he represented his clients. There are 4 cases they looked at, different kinds of cases. One's malpractice, one's succession. And basically, the argument is that he did not represent his clients well. He took money and didn't return it. He didn't file things he said he was going to file. He didn't communicate with them, things like that. And
then also regarding the hearing that was held, the investigation, that he did not cooperate fully enough with that,
yes.
too. So
that's another reason they recommended a pretty harsh sentence. Now, nothing's happened yet.
Right now, Cynthia Willard Lewis is saying, I wish this would have come out 2 months ago.
Well, but it did, actually. These were aired before the complaints were public before. So, it's not a total surprise, but certainly the recommendation just came out this week.
But, the confounding thing for me is that he's obviously a very bright guy. He went to Harvard Law School, which is the top of the top. I mean, What's going on?
It's confusing. And again, he's a very politically successful guy. He's the head of the Orleans Parish Democratic Executive Committee. Cedric Richmond, the congressman, used to work in his law office. It is a little confounding, it is. But what he says now is he's not really practicing law to make a living. He's focusing on his council activities. Look at how well everything's going in District D.
And he's married to a...
He's married to a judge.
But also, we should say this is just the first recommendation. There's several stages yet.
Exactly. So there's an appeal he has, and then it ultimately goes to the Louisiana Supreme Court, which will decide.
Of course, the seat he occupies was made available when John Johnson, who was the incumbent, was indicted.
Exactly.
So
it's jinxed.
It's jinxed, yes. And of course, John Johnson was back in the news in a story that I think the Lens wrote about he's trying to get some property waiver, a zoning variance, and he was rejected.
Yeah, but Councilman Gray, once again, he reiterates that this will not affect.
This has nothing to do with his public
councilman.
duties, and it will not affect them. That is what he says.
And also, he said, if you want any other comment about, talk to his attorney.
Go to my lawyer. Yes.
Talk to his attorney about it. All right, Stephanie, thanks a lot. All right, time to look ahead, folks. Errol, what do you see?
Well, we're used to having big sports events come to New Orleans that bring in a lot of people. Usually it's basketball or football, but next month we have WrestleMania that's coming, expecting to bring in 33,000 people. So there'll be a new crowd in town that I wouldn't mess around with if you see them.
33,000 wrestling fans?
Yeah.
Are you going?
No, I'm going to stay away. So.
And this is going to be at the Superdome?
I think so, yeah.
All right, Tyler?
I'm particularly looking next week at something that Stephanie referenced earlier, the lawsuits against the oil and gas company, and State Senator Robert Adley. I'm writing a long profile on him for the Lens. Is leading the charge to try to kill the lawsuit by getting the legislature to go along with that. And these bills may be heard next week in the state legislature at the first step in the process.
Now, that we have this legislative session up until the beginning of June, so we're not seeing things really rapidly moving through at this point.
Right. It's still slow, and also the governor doesn't really have an agenda, so that takes a little bit of the air out of the session.
We'll be watching. Thanks, Tyler. Dawn?
They did not get great weather for today, but tomorrow Hogs for the Cause continues at City Park, so it will smell good and taste good at City Park, and it all benefits pediatric brain cancer. And it's a bunch of amateur chefs making their barbecue out there, and they've been working hard.
Let's hope the rains will go away by tomorrow. Stephanie?
And it's going to be a big week in the legislature. The legislature will also be taking a look at Common Core, the other really hot issue this year. The House Education Committee has, it looks like, 2 full days of hearings scheduled on some of the bills that are aimed at ending or radically changing these educational standards.
All right. I want to thank you guys for being here this evening, and I want to thank you guys for watching us, and I hope that we'll see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.